Sarah Martinez adjusted her uniform for the 10th time that morning, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed down the fabric over her arms. Today was her first day at Camp Pendleton, and the butterflies in her stomach felt more like eagles. She had worked so hard to get here, spending 2 years in physical therapy and another year proving she was ready to return to active duty. The mirror in the barracks bathroom showed a young woman with determined brown eyes and short black hair that barely touched her collar. But it also showed something else, the intricate pattern of scars that covered her left arm and shoulder, souvenirs from an IED explosion in Afghanistan that had nearly ended her military career before it really began. Sarah had been just 22 when it happened. She was a communications specialist attached to a convoy that was delivering supplies to a remote outpost. The blast had thrown her vehicle 30 feet, and when she woke up in the field hospital 3 days later, the doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. The shrapnel had missed her vital organs by inches, but her left arm and shoulder bore the brunt of the explosion. The doctors said she would never serve again. The scars were too extensive, the nerve damage too severe. But Sarah had other plans. She spent every waking hour in physical therapy, pushing her body beyond what anyone thought possible. She learned to shoot with her right hand, retrained her muscle memory, and refused to accept that her military career was over. When she finally got medical clearance to return to active duty, Sarah thought the hardest part was behind her. She was wrong. Walking into the mess hall that first morning, Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her. She kept her head high and made her way to the serving line, pretending not to notice the whispers that followed her. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual morning chatter, but she could feel the change in atmosphere as she passed each table. "Hey, check out the new girl," someone said behind her, not bothering to lower his voice. "What happened to her arm? Looks like she got into a fight with a blender." Laughter erupted from the table, and Sarah's face burned with embarrassment. She grabbed a tray and focused on getting her breakfast, trying to ignore the comments that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. "Maybe she got too close to a campfire," another voice chimed in. "Or maybe she tried to pet a wildcat." More laughter. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for a piece of toast, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had prepared for this, she told herself. She knew it would be difficult. But she was stronger than their words. Finding an empty table in the corner, Sarah sat down and tried to eat her breakfast in peace. But the comments continued to drift over from nearby tables, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I heard she got those scars in a kitchen accident," someone said loud enough for half the mess hall to hear. "Maybe we should keep her away from the weapons." The laughter that followed was cruel and harsh, and Sarah felt her appetite disappear completely. She stared down at her untouched eggs and wondered if coming back had been a mistake. Maybe the doctors were right. Maybe she didn't belong here anymore. Over the next few weeks, the comments only got worse. During training exercises, some of the other Marines would make jokes about her appearance. They called her Patch behind her back, referring to the way her scars looked like patches sewn onto her skin. Others called her Shrapnel Sally or Boom Boom, names that made her stomach turn with their casual cruelty. Sarah tried to focus on her work, throwing herself into every assignment with the determination that had gotten her this far. She excelled in communications, her technical skills sharp. Despite the time away, she could operate radio equipment better than most of the Marines who had been there for years, and her knowledge of enemy communications patterns was exceptional. But none of that seemed to matter to her fellow Marines. During PT, she would catch them staring at her scars and whispering among themselves. In the barracks, conversations would stop when she walked into a room. The isolation was almost worse than the direct comments. Sergeant Williams, her immediate supervisor, was professional but distant. He never participated in the teasing, but he never stopped it either. Sarah began to wonder if he shared the others' opinion that she didn't belong. "Martinez, you're on communications duty for the night patrol," he would say, his voice neutral and businesslike. But Sarah could see something in his eyes that looked like pity, and she hated it almost as much as she hated the laughter. The breaking point came during a field training exercise 3 weeks into her assignment. Sarah was operating the radio equipment from a command tent, coordinating communications between different units spread across the training area. It was complex work that required split-second timing and absolute precision. She was in her element, her fingers flying across the radio controls as she managed multiple frequencies simultaneously. The exercise was going perfectly, with all units reporting in on schedule and coordination running smoothly. Then she heard it. Laughter from outside the tent. "I can't believe they put Scarface on communications," one Marine said to another as they passed by. "What if those scars affected her brain too? We could all get lost out here." "Maybe the explosion scrambled more than just her arm," his companion replied. "Hope she doesn't mix up the frequencies and send us all to the wrong coordinates." Their laughter faded as they walked away, but the damage was done. Sarah's concentration shattered, and for a moment she lost track of which unit was calling in. She quickly recovered, but the brief confusion was enough to create a small delay in the exercise timing. It wasn't a serious mistake, the kind of minor glitch that happened in every training exercise. But Sarah knew it would be noticed, and she knew exactly what people would say about it. That night, lying in her narrow bunk, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered if it was time to give up. The physical wounds from Afghanistan had healed as much as they ever would. But the emotional wounds her fellow Marines were inflicting seemed to get deeper every day. She thought about her family back in Texas, how proud they had been when she returned to active duty. Her younger brother had told all his friends that his sister was a war hero, and her parents had framed her new assignment letter and hung it in their living room. How could she explain to them that being a war hero didn't matter if your fellow soldiers couldn't see past your scars? The next morning brought a new humiliation. As Sarah was leaving the mess hall after breakfast, she overheard a group of Marines placing bets on how long she would last before requesting a transfer. "I give her 2 more weeks," one said confidently. "She's already cracking under the pressure." "Nah, she's tougher than she looks," another replied. "But those scars are freaking everyone out. Command's going to move her to a desk job soon enough. $20 says she's gone by the end of the month," a third voice added. "This isn't the place for damaged goods." Sarah's steps faltered, and she had to grab the doorframe to steady herself. Damaged goods? Is that what they saw when they looked at her? Not a Marine who had survived an explosion and fought her way back to active duty, but damaged goods that needed to be discarded? She made it to the bathroom before the tears started, locking herself in a stall and letting the frustration and pain pour out of her. She had been so strong for so long, pushing through the physical therapy, the doctor's doubts, the bureaucratic obstacles, but she hadn't prepared for this. For the way her own people would treat her like she was broken beyond repair. When she finally composed herself and returned to duty, Sarah noticed that even the support staff seemed to treat her differently. The clerks at the supply office spoke to her in overly loud voices, as if her scars had affected her hearing. The medics at sick call always asked if she was feeling okay with expressions of exaggerated concern. Everyone seemed to see her as a victim first and a Marine second, and Sarah began to wonder if that would ever change. She had proven her physical capabilities, demonstrated her technical skills, and shown up every day ready to do her job, but none of it seemed to matter. The worst part was the loneliness. Sarah had always been social, making friends easily wherever she was stationed. But here at Camp Pendleton, she ate most of her meals alone, spent her free time in solitude, and had no one to talk to about the daily struggles she faced. She tried calling home, but how could she explain to her family that the enemy wasn't trying to hurt her anymore? Her fellow Marines were doing that job just fine on their own. 3 months into her assignment at Camp Pendleton, Sarah had developed a routine that minimized her contact with other Marines. She arrived at the mess hall early to avoid the crowds, took her meals back to her workstation when possible, and spent her free time in the communications center where she could focus on equipment maintenance and training manuals. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Corporal James Peterson first approached her. Peterson was a communications specialist like Sarah, but he had been at Camp Pendleton for over 2 years and was respected by everyone in the unit. Sarah had noticed him before. He was always professional, never participated in the cruel jokes, and seemed to actually listen when she gave technical briefings. "Martinez," he said, pulling up a chair next to her workstation. "Mind if I ask you something?" Sarah looked up from the radio she was calibrating, surprised by the friendly tone in his voice. Most Marines only spoke to her when duty required it. "Sure, Corporal," she replied, setting down her tools. How did you learn to operate that AN/PRC-117G so efficiently? He asked, nodding toward the advanced radio system she had been working on. I've seen seasoned techs struggle with that equipment. But you make it look easy. For the first time in months, someone was asking about her professional skills rather than making comments about her appearance. Sarah felt a small spark of hope. I spent extra time studying the technical manuals during my recovery, she explained. When you can't do much physically, you have a lot of time to read and memorize procedures. I probably know those manuals better than anyone else here. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. It shows. The way you handled that frequency coordination during last week's exercise was impressive. You managed 6 different units without a single communication breakdown. Sarah's face brightened slightly. Someone had noticed her work, had seen past the scars to recognize her abilities. Thank you, Corporal. I try to stay sharp. Peterson, he corrected with a slight smile. When we're off duty, just call me Peterson. And I wanted you to know that not everyone here thinks like those idiots who make the jokes. It was the first real conversation Sarah had enjoyed since arriving at Camp Pendleton, and it gave her enough encouragement to keep pushing forward. Peterson began stopping by her workstation regularly, discussing technical challenges and sharing insights from his years of experience. But the cruel comments from other Marines continued. During a particularly difficult morning, while Sarah was conducting a communications check for an upcoming field exercise, she overheard 2 Marines talking near the equipment shed. I heard Command is thinking about moving Scarface to a different unit, one said, his voice carrying across the yard. Probably going to stick her somewhere. She won't scare the new recruits. About time, his companion replied. Those scars give me the creeps every time I see them. Makes me think about what could happen to any of us out there. Sarah's hands stilled on the radio controls. She understood now that their cruelty wasn't just about her appearance. It was about fear. Her scars were a visible reminder of the dangers they all faced, the vulnerability that every Marine carried but tried not to think about. That evening, Peterson found her in the communications center again, this time staring blankly at an equipment manual she had already memorized. Rough day? He asked, settling into the chair beside her. Sarah sighed deeply. They want me transferred, don't they? Command. Peterson was quiet for a long moment. There's been some discussion, he admitted. Some of the senior NCOs think it might be better for unit cohesion if you were moved to a different assignment. Because of my scars. Because some Marines are uncomfortable. And discomfort can affect performance, Peterson said carefully. But Martinez, you need to know that not everyone agrees with that assessment. There are people here who recognize your value. Not enough people, apparently. Peterson leaned forward, his expression serious. You know what I think? I think you're one of the best communications specialists I've ever worked with. Your technical knowledge is superior. Your attention to detail is exceptional. And you have a calm under pressure that most Marines would kill for. The fact that some people can't see past your scars is their problem, not yours. His words meant more to Sarah than he could have known, but they also highlighted how isolated she had become. One ally in 3 months wasn't enough to change the culture of an entire unit. The situation reached a crisis point the following week during a large-scale training exercise that involved multiple units from different bases. Sarah was assigned to the main communications hub, responsible for coordinating between ground forces, air support, and command elements. It was the kind of high-pressure assignment that showcased her abilities. The exercise began before dawn, with units moving into position across a vast training area. Sarah's job was to maintain constant communication between all elements, ensuring that orders were transmitted clearly and that situational reports reached the right commanders at the right time. For the first few hours, everything ran smoothly. Sarah managed the complex web of communications with the efficiency that Peterson had praised, keeping track of multiple frequencies and ensuring that critical information flowed seamlessly throughout the chain of command. Then the unexpected happened. A simulated enemy attack disrupted communications between 2 ground units, creating a gap in the information flow that could have compromised the entire exercise. Without hesitation, Sarah began rerouting communications through backup channels, her fingers flying across multiple radio sets as she worked to restore the connection. But as she worked, she became aware of a group of Marines standing behind her, and their comments grew increasingly cruel as the pressure mounted. "Look at Scarface go," one said mockingly. "Hope those scars don't affect her concentration when things get real. Maybe the explosion damaged her brain too," another added. "We could all be in trouble if she screws this up." "I still can't believe they put damaged goods in charge of something this important," a third voice chimed in. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she forced herself to focus on the radios. Too many people were depending on her to let the cruelty break her concentration. She successfully rerouted the communications, restoring contact between the isolated units and allowing the exercise to continue without interruption. It was a masterful display of technical skill and quick thinking under pressure. But instead of recognition, Sarah heard more laughter and cruel comments from the Marines behind her. "Lucky she didn't mess that up," one said. "Probably would have blamed it on her war wounds." "Yeah, my scars made me do it," another replied, mimicking what he apparently thought was Sarah's voice. Sarah's hands began to shake, and she had to grip the edge of the communications console to steady herself. She had just prevented a major communications failure, had demonstrated exactly the kind of skill and composure that Marines were supposed to value. But all they could see were her scars. Peterson, who had been monitoring a different frequency, noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor. He moved to her position and saw the group of Marines still making jokes behind her. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and experience. "Martinez just pulled off one of the most impressive communications recoveries I've ever seen, and you idiots are standing around making jokes?" The Marines fell silent. But Sarah could see the resentment in their eyes. They didn't appreciate being called out, and they would probably take it out on her later. The exercise continued for several more hours, and Sarah performed flawlessly throughout. But the damage was done. The cruel comments had shaken her confidence, and she began to second-guess every decision, every radio call, every technical adjustment. By the time the exercise ended, Sarah was emotionally exhausted. She had proven her abilities once again, but it seemed like no amount of professional excellence would be enough to overcome the prejudice she faced. That night, lying in her bunk, Sarah made a decision that had been building for weeks. She would request a transfer, not because she couldn't do the job, but because the constant emotional assault was wearing her down to the point where it might eventually affect her performance. She had survived an IED explosion, months of painful physical therapy, and a grueling return to active duty. But she wasn't sure she could survive much more of the psychological warfare her fellow Marines were waging against her. The next morning, Sarah sat down to write her transfer request. She stared at the blank form for over an hour, trying to find words that would explain her situation without sounding like she was making excuses or playing the victim. How do you explain that you're not leaving because you can't do the job, but because the people you're supposed to work with have made it clear that they don't want you there? As she struggled with the wording, Peterson appeared at her workstation. "Heard you might be putting in for a transfer," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. "That would be a real loss for this unit," Peterson continued, "and it would be letting them win." "Sometimes letting them win is the only way to stop losing yourself," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Peterson sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, there's something you should probably know about the exercise yesterday. Something that might change your perspective." Peterson's words hung in the air as Sarah looked up from her transfer request. She had been so focused on the cruel comments from the Marines behind her that she hadn't noticed much else during the exercise. "What do you mean?" she asked, setting down her pen. "General Morrison was observing the exercise yesterday," Peterson said quietly. "He was in the command post, watching how different units handled the communications challenges." Sarah felt her stomach drop. General Morrison was the base commander, a decorated veteran with over 25 years of service. If he had witnessed the cruel comments from the other Marines, it could mean serious trouble for everyone involved. "Did he hear what they were saying about me?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. Peterson shook his head. "That's not what I'm talking about." The general was focused on something else entirely. Your performance. When that communications breakdown happened and you rerouted everything through the backup channels, he was watching every move you made. Sarah frowned, confused. I don't understand. What does that have to do with anything? The general asked about you specifically, Peterson continued. He wanted to know your background, your training, how long you'd been at Camp Pendleton. When someone told him about your injury and recovery, he got very quiet. Before Sarah could respond, Peterson pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. This came through official channels this morning. You're being summoned to the general's office at 1,400 hours today. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the paper. A meeting with the general could mean anything. Commendation, reprimand, or the end of her military career. Given everything that had happened, she assumed the worst. Peterson, if this is about the comments those Marines were making, I don't want to get anyone in trouble. I just want to do my job. Martinez, Peterson said firmly, I don't think this is about what you think it's about. Trust me on this. The hours until the meeting crawled by like days. Sarah tried to focus on her regular duties, but her mind kept wandering to what General Morrison might want to discuss. She had heard stories about him. He was known for being fair, but demanding, with little patience for Marines who couldn't meet his standards. At 1,350 hours, Sarah stood outside the general's office, her dress uniform perfectly pressed and her shoes polished to a mirror shine. Despite her nervousness, she looked every inch the professional Marine she had worked so hard to become. Sergeant Martinez, reporting as ordered, sir, she said, as she was admitted to the office and snapped to attention. General Morrison was a tall, imposing man, with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He had been reviewing papers at his desk, but looked up as Sarah entered. At ease, Sergeant, he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She tried to read his expression, but the general's face revealed nothing. I observed the communications exercise yesterday, General Morrison began, leaning back in his chair. Specifically, I watched your handling of the simulated communications breakdown between Bravo and Charlie companies. Sarah's mouth felt dry, but she managed to respond. Yes, sir. I rerouted the communications through backup channels to maintain contact. In less than 90 seconds, the general added. Most communications specialists would have taken 3 times that long to diagnose the problem and implement a solution. How did you manage to respond so quickly? Oh, sir, I had studied the backup protocols extensively and had mentally rehearsed various failure scenarios. When the breakdown occurred, I immediately recognized the pattern and knew which alternative channels would be most effective. General Morrison nodded slowly. That level of preparation and quick thinking potentially saved the entire exercise from failure. It was exceptional work. Sarah felt a flicker of surprise, but maintained her professional demeanor. Thank you, sir. The general stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the training grounds. Sergeant Martinez, tell me about your injury in Afghanistan. The question caught Sarah off guard. But she answered honestly. Sir, I was part of a convoy that was hit by an IED. The explosion caused extensive injuries to my left arm and shoulder. I spent 18 months in recovery and rehabilitation before being cleared to return to active duty. And during that recovery period, you studied communications protocols? Yes, sir. I used the time to expand my technical knowledge and prepare for my return to service. General Morrison turned back to face her, and Sarah was surprised to see something that looked almost like respect in his eyes. Sergeant, I want to share something with you that very few people know. 22 years ago, I was a young captain deployed in Somalia. My convoy was ambushed, and I took shrapnel in my legs and back. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she remained at attention. The injuries weren't as visible as yours, the general continued, but the recovery was long and difficult. When I returned to duty, there were whispers about whether I was still fit for command, whether the injuries had affected my judgment or capability. He walked back to his desk and sat down, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. What I learned during that time was that some people will always see the wound first, and the Marines second. But the Marines worth serving alongside are the ones who see past the scars to recognize capability and dedication. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her voice steady. Yes, sir. Sir, yesterday, while you were performing that communications recovery, I was standing behind a group of Marines who were making disparaging comments about your appearance and your fitness for duty. Sarah's heart sank. So he had heard the cruel jokes after all. Sir, I would prefer not to pursue any disciplinary action against those Marines. They were just— General Morrison held up a hand, cutting her off. Sergeant, those Marines are going to face consequences for their unprofessional behavior. But that's not why I called you here today. He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out several documents. What struck me most yesterday wasn't the ignorance of a few Marines, but the fact that while they were making jokes, you were demonstrating exactly the kind of skill and composure under pressure that this corps needs. The general leaned forward, his expression intense. Sergeant Martinez, I'm offering you a position with the Communications Operations Center at Division Headquarters. It's a significant step up in responsibility, with opportunities for advanced training and career progression. Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. The position requires someone with exceptional technical skills, the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and the dedication to continuous learning and improvement. Based on what I observed yesterday, and what I've learned about your background, I believe you're exactly what we need. But sir, what about the concerns some Marines have expressed about my fitness for duty? General Morrison's expression hardened slightly. Sergeant, I've been in the Marine Corps for over 25 years. I've served with heroes, cowards, leaders, and followers. In my experience, the Marines who have been tested by fire and chosen to return to service anyway are among the most valuable assets this Corps has. He stood up again, his bearing formal and commanding. Your scars don't represent weakness, Sergeant Martinez. They represent survival, determination, and an unwillingness to quit when things get difficult. Those are exactly the qualities we need in positions of responsibility. Sarah felt tears threatening to form, but she blinked them back. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I want you to know that I've been considering requesting a transfer due to the difficulties I've experienced here. Because some Marines lack the maturity to see past surface appearances? Yes, sir. General Morrison walked around his desk and stood in front of Sarah, his expression serious but not unkind. Sergeant, if you accept this position, you'll be working directly with senior staff officers, coordinating communications for operations across multiple time zones, and training the next generation of communications specialists. The work is challenging, the standards are high, and there's no room for anything less than excellence. He paused, letting his words sink in. But you'll also be working with Marines who understand that capability matters more than appearance, and who recognize that someone who has faced adversity and overcome it brings valuable perspective to any team. Sarah thought about the months of cruel jokes, the isolation, the constant feeling that she didn't belong. Then she thought about Peterson's encouragement, about her own determination to prove that she could still serve effectively despite her injuries. Sir, may I ask you something? Of course. When you were recovering from your own injuries, did you ever consider leaving the Corps? General Morrison smiled slightly, the first real warmth Sarah had seen from him during the meeting. Every single day for about 6 months, he admitted. But then I realized that quitting wouldn't prove anything to the people who doubted me. And more importantly, it would mean I was doubting myself. He returned to his seat and picked up the transfer papers from his desk. The choice is yours, Sergeant Martinez. You can transfer to another unit and hope for better treatment. Or you can accept this promotion and show every Marine in this Corps that excellence speaks louder than prejudice. Sarah looked at the papers in his hands, then met his steady gaze. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, she felt like someone was seeing her as a Marine first and a victim second. Sir, I would be honored to accept the position. General Morrison nodded approvingly and signed the transfer orders. Outstanding. You'll report to Division Headquarters Monday morning. Your new supervisor, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, is expecting you. As Sarah prepared to leave, the general called her name one more time. "Sergeant Martinez, there's one more thing you should know. The Marines who made those inappropriate comments yesterday will be attending a mandatory training session on military bearing and respect for fellow service members. They'll also be writing formal apologies, which you can choose to accept or discard as you see fit. Sir, I appreciate that, but I hope they understand that my scars don't define my capabilities." "I believe they will after yesterday's demonstration," General Morrison replied. "But if they don't, that's their loss, not yours." 3 weeks later, Sarah was settling into her new role at division headquarters. The work was challenging and fast-paced. Exactly what she had hoped for when she fought so hard to return to active duty. Her colleagues treated her with the respect due any competent Marine, and her technical expertise was quickly recognized and valued. Peterson visited her new office on a Friday afternoon, grinning as he looked around at the sophisticated communications equipment. "Not bad for someone they wanted to transfer to a desk job," he said, clearly impressed. Sarah smiled back, feeling more confident than she had in months. Turns out there are worse things than a desk job, especially when the desk is running communications for half the Pacific Fleet. "So, no regrets about staying?" Sarah thought about the question seriously. The cruel comments from those Marines at Camp Pendleton still stung when she remembered them. But they no longer defined her experience in the Corps. "You know what I've learned?" she said finally. "There will always be people who see the scars first. But there are also people who see the Marine first. The capability first. The person first. The trick is not letting the first group convince you that they represent everyone." Peterson nodded approvingly. "And now you're in a position to influence how the next generation of communications specialists thinks about service and capability." Sarah looked out her office window at the Marines training on the grounds below. Some of them probably carried their own invisible scars, their own doubts about whether they belonged. "That's exactly what I plan to do," she said. "Show them that what matters isn't whether you've been knocked down, but whether you get back up and keep serving." Her scars would always be visible, a permanent reminder of the day her world exploded around her. But now they represented something different than they had when she first arrived at Camp Pendleton. They represented resilience, determination, and the kind of strength that could only be forged in the crucible of real adversity. And that was something worth laughing about. But this time, the laughter would be hers.